Hello, welcome to World Civilizations since 1500. Now, we're starting the second topic of the semester, which is titled Long Distance Trade, Climate Change, and Epidemics in the Making of the Early Modern World. So this is the first session of this second topic, and what we're going to be doing here is looking at the very initial events that began to, on one hand, dismantle the old world, the old economic and social and even religious systems very gradually, and paving the road to build a new one, which is going to be, of course, the modern world. So let me explain that in more detail. Let me first and foremost look at the outline so we can begin by looking at this grand title. So we are starting with this topic now, moving forward in the timeline to look at a series of changes and transformations that occurred, roughly speaking, from let's say the 1200s all the way to the 15 and 1600s AD. This is termed very loosely as the early modern world. And as the table of contents show, we're going to devote each one of those aspects of transformation to the three parts of this topic. The first part is going to look at long distance trade. This is again looking at the rise and expansion of global trade networks, something that occurred prior to the 1200s AD. Long distance trade emerged way back in the times, for example, of the Roman Empire and the Chinese Empire ruled by the Han Dynasty, for example. So we're going to start more or less there and move forward in the timeline. Just, it's a quick survey, of course, of how societies began to come together and they were tied commercially, so to speak, and those trading networks that emerged in different parts of the globe. We will discuss a few of them, the most important ones, how by the 12, 13, and 1400s they're now coming together and becoming a single international system. This is what we're going to be looking at again in part one. In part two, we're going to look at climate change. This is going to be yet another aspect of change and transformation that is going to alter the ways people lived, the way peoples went about doing their economic activity as well. And even their religious worldviews as well will be questioned in some parts of the world as a result of the changes that transpired during this time that altered the climate, for example, and set off a series of nomadic invasions around the world. We're going to get to see that rather closely, climate change, how that led to world transformations. Part 3 is going to look at another aspect of environmental impacts. Again, this is something that was really related to the environment, to nature, and to a certain degree to climate change as well. And this is epidemic disease. We're going to see how during the particularly the 1300s AD, we're going to see for the first time in global history the transformation of epidemics into pandemics. And this is yet another force in history that is going to also dismantle the old system and pave the road for the arrival of the modern world. And this is what we generally we're going to cover in this topic. All right, so before we start with part 1, as a general introduction, I just want to, once again, stress the main analytical point of this topic, why it's important, how is it significant for understanding world civilizations and also world history at large. And what's important here is that up to, let us just say, the 1200s AD, one of the main engines of history that was pushing human beings to create communities and societies and economic systems and religious worldviews, one of the main engines of history was the environment. Really, again, human beings were confronted with the environment in different parts of the world, different ecologies, different settings, and they were trying to adapt, survive by developing different modes of subsistence, some of which were centered almost exclusively in different parts of the world on agricultural production. We looked at that in the first topic. Many of the tools that human beings developed, or their technologies, were also devised in order to deal with environmental hardships and challenges. We looked at that as well in the first topic as well, like the irrigation systems, canals, and hydraulic systems of different kinds, etc. So the environment was really in charge, so to speak, of human historical development. And human beings were really just battling the environment, trying to accommodate to different climates and really create civilizations that in many ways mirror the natural landscape. Many of the cultural features and ideas of each civilization were really developed from people's experience with the environment. But as we move into the 1200s, 1300s AD, there will be other forces that are going to intervene in the process of historical development. Some of those forces were created by human beings in order to not only survive but enhance their wealth, to maximize their comforts and produce riches. Again, to have, in other words, a surplus for them to create a civilization based on wealth and comfort, luxury, etc., and the like. And this is why it's important to look at trade, okay, long distance trade particularly, because what human beings discovered is that besides agriculture, which was quite reliable, I mean, this is really a subsistence strategy that allow human beings to live in the world, to survive and perpetuate their communities and cultures over time. What they discovered is that besides agriculture, trade provided yet another avenue for people to create wealth, which was more reliable and also offered more rewards as well than agriculture. Agriculture has its limitations. It just provides foodstuffs for people to survive in the world. But with trade, once people are generating either luxury crops, for example, commodities or manufactured goods of different kinds that are in demand in different parts of the globe, and they're willing to export those goods across the world in order to make money, in other words, to accumulate, let's say, gold and silver, then that became a very enticing strategy and alternative to build an economy that was not going to rely exclusively on agricultural products and taxing peasants, but rather an economy that was going to rely on the manufacturing, production of luxury goods, commodities for exports, which in turn brought into their communities, into their family businesses, or into the coffers of the rulers of the kingdoms, the opportunities to accumulate wealth, riches like gold and silver, for example. And so this is going to actually change, again, human societies, this idea that we can build an economy based on trade to accumulate wealth in order to make the economy grow, to live more comfortably. This is going to be really the very first experience of what later on will become the system otherwise known as capitalism. This is, again, the system that emerges with modernity. We're going to get to see that the emergence of capitalism down the line, in a future topic. So this is going to be like the early stages, so to speak, the baby steps towards a capitalist society and a capitalist economy much, much later, the emergence of long-distance trade. And this is going to change the course of history, as we'll see. The other issues we're going to get to see is climate change and epidemic disease. As I just explained a moment ago, those were the other engines of history, pushing history forward, is the climate. We're going to get to see a change of climate in the world, something that started out around 850 AD and affected the whole globe, particularly the northern part of the globe, for about 4 centuries. Okay, we're going to get to see that. And what that did is that this is going to alter the relationships between the nomadic groups that inhabited many regions, particularly in the northern globe, and also the sedentary societies, the major civilizations of the world that will be now subject to a series of invasions and attacks, of course. So we're going to get to see that as well, how many of the civilizations that we looked at in part 1 will be invaded by the nomads, and this is going to really change the course of history, because now the nomads are taking charge of those civilizations, as we'll see. Okay? And they're going to be moving history in a different direction as well. Epidemic disease was also something that emerges in the 13 and 1400s as a result of the environment, as a result of climate change. And we're going to see that certain viruses that affected people in one part of the world are now going to spread across the globe due to the fact that by the 13 and 1400s, there's already a global network of commercial exchange tying many of the continents together. And as goods were flowing from one part of the world to another, what we see is that merchants were not only exchanging products and goods and commodities across vast distances, they're also exchanging germs as well. So despite the fact that there will be an epidemic disease happening, let's say, in an isolated remote area of Asia, as it happened in the early 1300s with the bubonic plague or black plague, now because there's international trading networks, the bubonic plague that affected some communities of Asia and China are now going to find expression, diffusion across the network, whether we're looking at India being affected or the Middle East and also Europe. And this is also going to weaken and shatter, again, the old institutions. The old institutions of the past, whether those were social relationships, political systems, religious worldviews, are going to start shaking as a result of the Black Death. And with the discovery of America, when the Europeans arrived to the New World, in this case the Spaniards, and they encountered 2 great empires like the Aztecs of Central Mexico, the Incas of South America, the Europeans also brought with them in their encounters with the Native Americans their own germs as well. And this is going to also have a profound effect in the so-called Spanish conquest of the Aztecs and the Incas. And one of the main reasons, and perhaps the most important reason, why the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire were subdued and conquered by the Spaniards was precisely because of epidemic disease. Again, the rapid spread again of things like yellow fever and smallpox again really decimated the imperial armies of those 2 large land-based empires. So this is something that we're going to see in this topic, this is why it's important. We're really examining here three engines of historical change that are going to actually initiate the early modern world. Again, long distance trade, climate change, and epidemic disease are really setting the stage for the opening act of modernity. They're shattering the old institutions. Even old empires are crumbling, like the Aztecs and the Incas. In European feudalism is also going to crumble in very important ways as a result of those forces. And this is going to really, create the conditions for a new type of system, the modern system. In other words, the emergence of capitalism, for example, begins around 1500 AD, thereabouts. The early stages of that. The early stages of modern science as well begins also around that time, due to the fact that people were questioning their religious ideas, their religious assumptions, and they wanted to study the natural world in a more effective way in order to understand something like epidemics, for example, or understand natural phenomena. And they decided to create a new science, modern science, for example. So we're going to get to see, again, how the old world is beginning to dismantle slowly and a new one begin, again, by looking at this topic. And one of the most important effects of this period of time is that as a result of those historical forces shattering the old institutions and paving the road for new ones, this is also going to start creating the initial process of something that much later in the 20th and 21st century, something that today we refer as globalization, the process of globalization, the integration, in other words, of world cultures, the integration of world civilizations. It all got started around the 12 and 1300s through this network of trade. So the integration was commercial. It all started commercial, but beyond the commercial or economic integration of all of the economies of the world through this network of trade, what we see is that people were not only trading goods, they were also trading ideas as well, cultural ideas. So again, this is also characterized or characteristic by the process of globalization, the integration also of all of the cultures of the world as well. So it's not only an economic integration, there's also a cultural integration as well. Religious, cultural ideas were flowing back and forth across the network. Okay, so this is really the beginning stages of both modernity and also globalization. Okay. All right. So now let's look at part one, and we're looking at long distance trade. This is not just the kind of trade that took place between neighboring communities or towns. We're looking at the integration of societies that were separated in space and time across vast distances. And we're going to see the rise and expansion of global trade networks. There were several that were major networks. We're going to get to see one in Eurasia, another one in Southeast Asia, one in North Africa, another one in the Indian Ocean, and finally one in the Mediterranean world. And as I said, at some point, as we move into the 13 and 1400s, all of those networks are going to intersect and connect and become a single network. Okay? Now, before we looked at those different trade networks, it is important to note, first and foremost, that one of the changes that trade brought about in world history is that the economies of kingdoms, the economies of principalities and empires are gradually transitioning from being centered exclusively on agricultural production to economies that are going to be moving towards trade. This is very, very important and very significant, for the kind of world that modernity is going to create. Economies that are centered on growth, economic growth, in other words. As I mentioned a moment ago, in the age of agriculture, economies did not grow very much. And they did not grow very much because all that was taxable were agricultural products. Okay, taxing the peasantry. Every year there will be products to tax to sustain the bureaucracies, for example, the administrators, the royal family, and so on. Yeah, they were quite reliable, those agricultural products. But this idea that year by year the economy was going to expand and grow and so on, again, in the age of agriculture, it was very, very, very limited. But with trade, this is going to start changing. Once state systems around the world are moving towards trade, now the possibility of economic growth and expansion is possible. Okay? So keep that in mind. This is why this is going to be very central, very important as we discuss those networks one by one. Now, despite the fact that the networks that we're going to get to see are moving towards trade and they control trading routes and trading networks in certain regions of the world, they experience so many limitations nonetheless. Okay? There were severe limitations that they had to face. For example, the roads, when we look at, for example, the ancient world or even the Middle Ages, prior to the time of the early modern world, and even when we look at the early modern world, nonetheless, the roads that merchants built in order to carry goods from one region to another were very undeveloped, let us just say. Okay? Those were actually what we call today just dirt roads, in other words. Okay? Very often, and more often than not, merchants will experience many hardships along those roads. They will stall, for example, whenever they're carrying goods. They will stall every time there was a flooding, for example, or even rainfall. Again, they will just stall for hours, in many cases for many days. Again, so the pace of trade was extremely, extremely slow across those networks, particularly inland. The transportation systems were also quite undeveloped. What was available were just ox carts, for example, or horse carts, and people will load up cargo there and just propel them through the animal muscle, and that was also very limited as well. There's only so much cargo you can move from one region to another. Okay, and it moves very slow across the network. Okay, so it took weeks and months, again, to travel from one kingdom to another, for example, even though they were close to each other. When it comes, for example, to navigation systems, they were also quite limited prior to the early modern world. Transportation technologies, navigations systems, vessels, for example, were also limited in that they were small vessels, and people, more often than not, travel along the coastline. They did not want to move into the middle of the ocean without actually having knowledge of the sea, where they were going. In many cases, they did not know where they were going. They couldn't orient themselves. So they would not dare to venture so much into the open waters of a large body of water, like the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean, just because, again, they just could not orient themselves. And of course, sea storms, will just devastate their vessels, and there will be, of course, casualties and a loss of cargo and the like. So more often than not, people travel very close to the coastline, and there will be trading outposts along the coastline, meeting or nexus points where merchants will meet and exchange goods back and forth. So even though there were navigation systems, and we're going to be talking about some of those, keep in mind that they were not that developed. Even though they were there, they were not that developed. This is not the kind of cargo ships, for example, that the Portuguese built in the 1400s. Some of the ships that the Portuguese built are going to be used, for example, by Christopher Columbus, and later on by all the other trading empires we're going to get to see in the next topic, the rise of the trading empires. So they were not that developed. Okay, so there were severe limitations to that. And another, of course, is banditry and piracy on the high seas or ocean-going voyages, for example. There were pirates seizing cargo, and inland there were also bandits that will raid caravans, for example, or merchants carrying goods, and they will just steal their wealth or their cargo. And in many cases, merchants will also be severely affected. Some of them actually were murdered as well along those trading networks as well. So again, this is something that many pre-modern societies had to face. Now, what is significant here is that, as I mentioned a moment ago, the trading systems that developed before the pre-modern world leading up to the early modern period and even beyond served to connect the different civilizations together through a system of networks, and this allowed for the exchange of three main things. One is, and this is again quite evidently, is the exchange of goods. So what is really being exchanged across vast distances? Commercial goods of different kinds. But as we'll see, along those networks, there's also an exchange of ideas, particularly religious ideas, cultural ideas, languages, for example, writing systems, certain technologies, for instance. And this served to diffuse certain characteristics of a civilization to different parts of the world, thereby really creating the initial stages of globalization, as I just explained, globalization. But also, as I explained a moment ago, is that there's another thing that people exchange when they engage in trade, and that is that they also exchange germs. Okay, so keep that in mind, because eventually, as we're moving into particularly part 2 and part 3, this is going to become central to our discussion here. Okay, why trade is so significant? It's not just because it's building a new economy, but because it's also allowing for the dissemination of ideas, religions, and cultures, but also epidemics as well. Okay. All right. So let's look at the trade systems that are beginning to tie societies together. Okay. And we start with one of the most important highway, so to speak, that connected China, parts of the Indian subcontinent, Central Asia, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean world, all the way to Europe, Western Europe, what we call Eurasia. And this highway, so to speak, this is the very first international highway, so to speak, was the Silk Road. Okay? And this is not just a single road, the way we picture it, for example, a major highway that runs across, for example, the United States, or across, the entire European continent. It was more of a system of roads that together constituted a single system, otherwise known as the Silk Road. And the origins of this major commercial network goes back to the ancient world, and we're looking at, in this case, ancient China, when we see the Han Dynasty seizing control of China in 207 BC. And remember, by this time, China is already an empire. It had been built by the dynasty before the Han Dynasty, the Qing Dynasty, by Shi Huangdi. Remember, he unified all of China and created the very first imperial administration, the empire. And the Han Dynasty inherited the empire, and what they're trying to do is expand the empire territorially, but also economically as well. They're interested in economic expansion. Okay, so this is very important. And the Han Dynasty, in order to expand the economy, they decided to move into trade. Again, so once again, trade is considered by the Han Dynasty as that strategy to start accumulating more and more revenues, bringing in more resources into the state. Okay, because just taxing agriculture, was not going to do it, as I explained. And so he is promoting commerce within the empire, merchants, for example, producers, to manufacture goods that will find a market outside of China. So this is the very first time that China is going to start reaching out to other areas of the world, at least from an economic perspective, economically. Because prior to this time, China had been pretty much developing in almost splendid isolation from the rest of the world. It was rather an isolated culture and society. But now there's going to be a network that will extend into parts of Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, moving to the Middle East, and eventually, as we'll see, this network is going to reach all the way to Europe. In particular, this is a network that will be controlled, at least in the Mediterranean Ocean, by the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty were actually contemporaries. Okay, they were contemporaries. Just when you see the rise of the Roman Empire, we see the rise of the Hans, for example, in China. So one of the items that found a market outside of China, that there was a great demand for it, particularly in Europe, among the Romans, for example, was silk. This is something that the Chinese produced. And we're going to see that the Han Dynasty sponsored silk production, and they are really trying to mass produce it, so to speak, to export it and bring in more revenues into the state. Okay, so this led to this massive expansion of trade networks, and we see again this network being developed, so-called the Silk Roads. Again, that took centuries, of course, to build. This is not something that is happening overnight. Remember that the Han Dynasty ruled all the way to the 200s AD, about 4 centuries or so in China. So while the Hans were in power, we're going to see again this massive expansion of trade. So Chinese silks were flowing from east to west across that network, reaching all the way to the Mediterranean Ocean, as you can see here. And by this time, the Romans had already controlled the Mediterranean network. All the Mediterranean trade was in control of Rome. So the silks entered Rome via that network that they control here regionally. And in return, the Romans were paying silver to the merchants that were carrying those silks. And so silver was flowing east. So again, from east to west, we see silks flowing through the network, and from west back to the east, we have Roman silver, again, running across the network. Okay, so we can say that on some level, the economies of China and Europe intersected at some point. Now, this doesn't mean that those economies were integrated and they function as a single whole. No, that didn't mean that. Again, what it means that this is a link tying two grand civilizations together, at least on a commercial level. And the trade was, like I said, rather limited, and there were just a handful of merchants that were in charge of this process as well. So, that relationship was also rather intimate as well. Okay, it is just only a handful of people that are in charge of that. Now, as I said, this is not just a commercial network, this is also a cultural network as well. What was flowing back and forth across the Silk Road were not only silks and other commercial goods, but also we have cultural and religious ideas. In fact, the Silk Road became known for a highway that facilitated the spread of world cultures and religions. A great many people that were persecuted for their beliefs, for example, by their official institutions, actually went into the Silk Road and found refuge or a safe haven, for example, for them to actually create their religious communities and churches there, because the Silk Road was the recipient of just so many different ethnic, cultural, linguistic, and religious groups. It was just so diverse that it was impossible for a single group to impose their religion or their culture on everybody else. So this was a very decentralized society along the Silk Road. Decentralized, meaning that there's no central government or central church trying to dominate the entire network and trying to impose one faith. So again, this is extremely important. It's decentralized, okay? So we have this decentralization, but at the same time that we find decentralization, we also find that as religious groups and religious exiles and people that were persecuted by their monarchs, by their religious institutions, went into the network, as they created their churches and communities, because the environment was very diverse, socially, culturally, religiously, there was also an environment that kind of allowed for a borrowing and sharing of religious and cultural ideas, to the point that many of the religions that moved into the network became hybrids. Okay, they adopted elements from other schools of thought, philosophies, and religions, and there's a lot of mixture again in the network. This is something called syncretism. Syncretism is when we have a mixture of different religions or different philosophies into one. Again, it's like a hybrid, so to speak. Why this is important is because the Silk Road is going to provide a sort of blueprint for how the process of globalization is going to unfold much, much later. In other words, once people are engaged in commercial exchange, they're moving through a certain network, moving goods and so on, we're also going to see a merge of different faiths, different cultures along the networks, and this is going to start creating what today scholars call the formation of a single global culture, a syncretism of all the cultures of the world into one. Again, this is something that we're in the middle of. This is not to say that all of the cultures of the world have become one, but we're in the middle of that. Again, that the cultures everywhere around the world, everywhere you look at today in the 21st century, are hybrids. The cultures, it's very difficult actually to find a culture anywhere in the world that you will say this is a pure culture that has suffered no change over the course of centuries, since that culture was formed. Okay, all cultures have suffered transformations, alterations, changes, because we live in a globalized world. So the Silk Road was kind of like the beginning of that, if you will. Okay. All right. So I will just talk about a few examples of how the Silk Road served to disseminate world cultures and religions. For example, Buddhism spread across Asia through the Silk Road. Buddhist missionaries and monks that were moving out of the Indian subcontinent. We talked, for example, about King Ashoka, the king of India that sponsored Buddhism, and he sponsored missions and missionaries across India to spread Buddhism far and wide. Well, even after the death of King Ashoka, we see that Buddhist missionaries continue their missionary activities by moving their faith, their philosophy, or their religion for that matter, Buddhism, into Asia. And so they moved across the Silk Road. And we see, of course, Buddhist missionaries moving across the Silk Road, and they reached all the way to, China. And indeed, they also moved into places like Japan. This is, the time when China and Japan turned to Buddhism, from the year 200 all the way to 600 AD. And because of the incredible diversity along the Silk Road, what we see is that Buddhism suffered transformation. It became syncretized. In other words, once it reached China, it was already mixing native ideas from Chinese philosophical schools like Confucianism, for example, and Taoism. We talked about that again in the previous topic. So Buddhism was palatable, it was appealing and compelling to the Chinese masses due to the fact that it had mixed some of the original ideas of the Buddha, who lived in India, with indigenous ideas of China. And so that really was a very appealing and actually very compelling characteristic of Chinese Buddhism. And at some point, there will be a massive conversion to Buddhism in China, to the point that the rulers of China, this dynasty that seizes power in 619 AD, the Tang dynasty, for example, turned to Buddhism as a way to legitimize their rule. Now, the masses had already converted to Buddhism, so they sponsored that philosophy or religion and made it the official religion of the Chinese state. Okay, Buddhism. So they sponsored the building of thousands of monasteries across China, Buddhist monasteries, and we see for about 3 centuries or so, Buddhism really being the dominant faith of all of China. By the early 900s, of course, Buddhism was actually abolished, by the way. But for a while, again, it was the official religion of the Chinese state. So we can see how a faith that emerges in one part of the world, North India, ends up in another, in China, and at some point, out of expediency, the rulers of China turned to Buddhism as a strategy for legitimizing their authority. China, under the Tang, also exports Chinese culture, certain Chinese scientific, technological innovations to the West across that network. Things like, for example, paper, iron tools, and iron making as well is going to be exported into the West. The knowledge how to actually craft iron moves into places like the Middle East and Central Asia. Ceramics, as well, and even gunpowder as well, again, across the Silk Road. China is also going to receive influences from the West when there were many aspects of Greek culture that moved into places like Tibet, Central Asia, eventually moving into China proper. This is something that historians call Hellenistic culture. Hellenistic culture is really Greek culture. This is the kind of culture that was expanded by Alexander the Great when Alexander the Great conquered the Middle East and parts of North India. It's called Hellenistic culture. It's Greek. Like Greek mathematics, for example, Greek astronomy, physiology, aspects of medicine are going to be moving into Asia across the Silk Road as well. When merchants travel, once again, they're not only bringing goods into Asia, they're also bringing with them books about Greek mathematics, astronomy, and also medicine. And those ideas are going to be absorbed by the East, by the Eastern societies. Another very important religion that moved through the network and spread into Central Asia was one of the branches of Christianity that was actually persecuted in Europe. We don't know much about it because, again, this sect, so to speak, were persecuted for their unorthodox beliefs. This is a sect or a branch of Christianity otherwise known as the Nestorian Christians. Nestorian Christians. What the Nestorians believed is that Jesus had a dual nature, for example. Jesus Christ, which according to the orthodox doctrines of the Christian church in Europe, Christ was considered to be a divine figure, the Son of God. There was a divinity, and the focus was on his divinity. But the Nestorians believed that Jesus had a dual nature. He was both a man, just a human being, a regular human being like everybody else, that had limitations of different kinds, but also had a divine nature as well, like a special kind of status, like a Messiah, somebody that was sent by God to do a very important work. So that was called a heresy, and they were persecuted. And the Nestorians moved into the network across the Silk Road, and there they found refuge, and they built their churches, a series of communities, and so on. They proliferated for a while until the Nestorians began absorbing the ideas of the other groups of the network, the Buddhist, Taoist, for example, even the Islamic, for example, ideas that the Muslim merchants were carrying along the network. And over time, the Nestorians, were so syncretized that the original teachings were totally blended with other faiths, along the network. Islam also spread across the Silk Road. We talked about how Islam spread across vast distances in the Arabian Peninsula through the actions and policies of the Caliphate, for example, and they spread across the Eastern Mediterranean, parts of Africa, Egypt, North Africa, and also Western Europe as well. But Islam also spread into the Silk Road as well. And we're going to see merchants moving into the network, Muslim merchants, and they brought with them their unique branch of Islam. And what is very, very significant to note here is that while in the Islamic world, the Muslims were quite divided between two branches, two sects, the Sunnis and the Shiites. We explained that in part 1. There was constant infighting between those two. In the Silk Road, there was a kind of relatively peaceful coexistence between Sunnis and Shiites, because the environment was just so diverse. There was no central church. Remember, there was no central political entity that could enforce or impose a certain branch of religious doctrine. So therefore, we see this kind of peaceful coexistence between the Sunnis and the Shiites. We also see another sect, another branch of Islam moving into the network, the Sufis, as they were known. And the Sufis were the mystics of Islam, those that actually prefer a more mystical experience and a personal encounter with the divine. They were not so much concerned about the Quran or the law necessarily to follow them very strictly, but rather, to really seek a more mystical experience. And they also moved through the network, and they were responsible for spreading Islam across the network, a version of Islam that allowed for syncretism, meaning that the Sufis were not so concerned about people abandoning their old religious ideas and just accepting a new one, but rather they allowed people to continue their faiths, their religious beliefs and practices, but with the idea that it was possible for people to have a mystical relationship with the divine. Okay, so we see the spread of Islam also across the Silk Road. Okay, so this is why it's significant. The Silk Road is tying societies together, is tying economies and also cultures and religions. Okay, the second network that is emerging in the distant past, kind of contemporary to the Silk Road, so to speak, was a network that is flourishing in Southeast Asia. We're going to see another network there. And those networks were important because those are not going to be necessarily land-based, but those are going to be actually navigation networks in which merchants traveling in vessels from China to India and the Middle East and parts of East Africa will have to, at some point, cross through this network. Okay? And it is here that we see the emergence of certain kingdoms in Southeast Asia that are going to be controlling those networks. The first kingdom was the kingdom of Funan, as it was called. This kingdom actually initiated in the 1st century AD. It spanned all the way to the 5th century. And this is a kingdom that unified great portions of this peninsula in Southeast Asia, which really was tying together different clans, for example, different lineage groups together. And this is going to create a vast, vast political entity, the Kingdom of Funan, as it was called. This is really the kingdom that originated the present-day country of Vietnam, for example. It also included the present-day country of Cambodia, as you can see, parts of what is modern-day Thailand and Malaysia as well, okay, in Southeast Asia. And this is one of the examples of a society that was transitioning from agriculture, from the production of rice, now to the control of long-distance trade. Because what actually occurred here is that as we see merchants, let's say, coming from China, moving into Southeast Asia, delivering things like silks, for example. We talked about the Hans, for example, trying to export silks. Now there's going to be a network that is going to be taking the products from China into the Indian Ocean, and by necessity, many of those merchants needed to move their cargo along the territory of Funan to the other end of the peninsula, where there will be other trading outposts there for merchants to continue their journey, taking, for example, the Chinese silks, the ceramics, for example, and other products that China produced, to take those products into places like India, for instance, and beyond, even including the Middle East, Persia as well. So this became a sort of middleman, Funan in other words, whereby merchants traveling back and forth from China, but also from Persia and from India, will have to cross their products back and forth. So what the rulers of Funan were doing, it was just taxing merchants coming back and forth. Again, taxing the trade. They had a network inland, and they were pretty much taking control. They were in the middle of the network and pretty much taking advantage, again, of their geographical position and trying to enhance their revenues by taxing the trade. Once again, this was a nexus point between China, the Indian Ocean, Persia, and including the Mediterranean as well. So even products produced in India, like for example spices and so on, will also be shipped to China through that network and so on. Okay, so here we also see the spread of world cultures and religions. Here what we see is that Indian merchants are going to bring with them not only goods like spices and other agricultural products, but they're going to bring also their religions, Hinduism and Buddhism. Okay, and this led to the massive conversion of Southeast Asian societies to either Hinduism and Buddhism. So this is the time of this conversion, again, that is taking place. And it is really, again, a conversion out of the contact, the encounters with other societies through those networks. Okay, so this is extremely important, how this is actually unfolding very early on. Now, at some point, the kingdom of Funan is going to decline as a result of losing control of this network when there were merchants that were trying to find an alternative route to bypass moving the products, the cargo inland across that kingdom and trying to avoid the hassles of paying tribute and taxes to the rulers of Funan. Again, so they're going to, merchants again, develop another network that entail moving across the Straits of Malacca, as it is called. Again, this is a very narrow strip of water that divides two islands or two archipelagos, and they're going to cross, through the straits, and they're going to use it as another highway. And again, it's going to render the kingdom of Yunnan or Funan totally irrelevant. And this is one of the reasons why that kingdom is going to really decline, Funan. And this is going to lead to the rise of another kingdom in Southeast Asia that is going to move forward and take control of that network, of that highway, that is to say. And this is going to be a specific clan of Malaysia, as I'm going to explain in just a few seconds here. And that clan, by controlling this network, is going to create not only a kingdom for themselves, but actually a trading empire. The empire that was otherwise known as Srivijaya. The Srivijaya Empire that was formed around 670, and it also is going to decline around 1025 AD. Okay, so this is again a society, a clan that took advantage, just like the kingdom of Funan took advantage of this highway of trade and taxing it and controlling it. This is also a highway that will be controlled, monopolized to a certain degree by the Malaysian people, particularly a clan of Malaysia, otherwise known as the Malay clan. They were expert seamen. Again, they were experts in navigation. Once again, those transportation systems were not very sophisticated, but they were actually very skilled in the sea. And also they were very skilled warriors. So this is going to give them an asset, an advantage for controlling the network, that they knew the waters and they conducted warfare as well. This is a clan, it's a warrior clan, it's also a clan of navigators, and this actually, again, allowed them to build this empire. They're also undergoing conversion. They are going to create a Buddhist empire as a result of their encounters with the Buddhist societies, particularly coming from India, but also coming from China. Remember that China went Buddhist as well, the Tang Dynasty. So in many cases, out of expediency or convenience, many of the rulers of kingdoms or empires that were in the middle of a certain network, and they were trying to seize control of those trade routes, ended up converting to certain religions out of expediency because they believed that it was in their best interest to deal with foreign powers. They will have certain benefits if they share the same values, the same faith. In this case, Buddhism, for example. They ended up building large navies and a massive army to control the network, and this allowed them to create this empire that spanned for about 5 centuries or so. Okay? And they will often defend their territory, they will often defend their network through the use of warfare, because often there were rivals that contested the monopoly that they exercised, and of course that required defending it through force. Another innovation of this empire in Southeast Asia is the implementation of a standardized system of weights and measures, that in order to create a cohesive system that will be fair for all parties, because there are people coming from different areas of the globe across the network, they created a standardized system of weights and measure, that every cargo was measured, was weighted to be taxed, and also all buying and selling of products that took place in that region was also carried out in a very precise way through this standardized system. Again, so this is extremely important because this is going to be one of the major characteristics of the modern trading empires we're going to get to see starting in the next topic. The rise of the trading empires is standardization. As those empires began to extend far and wide across the globe, it required some standardized system to operate, in other words. Now, the decline of Srivijaja was also due to the influence of other merchants that slowly but surely began to take control of the network. And those were merchants that brought a different faith other than Buddhism, and this faith at the same time allowed them to create a more uniform trading system that rendered the Srivijaja empire also quite irrelevant as well. We're talking about the Muslim merchants. Muslim merchants were not only moving across the Silk Road, they were also moving across this network that moved across the Persian Gulf, for example, the Indian Ocean, and also Southeast Asia. And they were creating outposts at every turn, leaving Muslim merchants and communities there. And as they're doing this, they are in the process of establishing Muslim communities across the network, creating a common culture. A culture based on Islam, for example. And here we see, for example, the ability of all partners engaged in the network to understand each other because they share a common culture. It's not just the faith, but it's also the language, Arabic, for example. Okay, so Arabic becomes like a lingua franca, like a common language for people to communicate across the network, and that provided cohesion and uniformity of this network in Southeast Asia. And of course, there's shared customs, shared traditions, but also laws. The laws of trade that the Muslims followed were also uniform because they all derived from the Quran. Again, the Quran provided pretty much the prescriptions, the rules, the regulations for every human activity, including economic and commercial activities as well. So this is creating cohesion, again, across the network, something that is uniform, whether we're talking about East Africa, whether we're talking about the Arabian Peninsula, the Persian Gulf, parts of the Indian Ocean, and now Southeast Asia as well. Again, so this is going to lead to the downfall, so to speak, of that empire as this is becoming more and more dominated, so to speak, by the Muslim merchants after 1025 AD. All right, so the following network that we're going to get to see here is going to be a network that flourished in the African continent. So we are looking at different regions of the globe. We looked at Eurasia, the Silk Road, Southeast Asia, and now we're moving into Africa. Here, what we see is a vast network that interconnected different chiefdoms, principalities, towns, settlements, communities, tribal groups together through a system of trade networks that span from West Africa all the way to North Africa across what is called the Sub-Saharan Desert. And all of this is going to become a single network, okay, that operated pretty much in a very uniform fashion as well on so many levels. Now, here, just like we saw in Southeast Asia, for example, the actions of the Kingdom of Funan and Srivijaya, for example, creating that network. And in the Silk Road, it was actually created, sponsored by the Chinese imperial government of the Han Dynasty. Here, it was a network that was largely sponsored by an empire. It started out as a kingdom, and eventually they transformed the kingdom into a trading empire. We're talking about the Mali Empire, okay? The Kingdom of Mali, that through the construction of this network and their significant role as major exporters of gold, as we'll see, they're going to become actually an empire in their own right in the African continent. Now, let's look at the Kingdom of Mali. As you can see in this map, again, this is really in West Africa and the northern region of Africa. And to understand the rise of Mali, it's extremely important to look at the geography of West Africa. What was so unique about this geography that allowed for the flourishing of this society in terms of their significant and critical role in promoting trade, building those networks, and pretty much dominating the trade for several centuries. Well, first and foremost, the geography of West Africa is one in which it is permeated by grasslands and forests, for example. This is lush vegetation, plenty of trees, and so on, very productive, and also quite fertile at the same time. And they're going to have, as we'll see, significant critical resources that will be of great need for the desert peoples of the sub-Saharan desert. Okay, so they are indeed in a region that is bordering the desert, in other words, and this is a vast desert. Most of North Africa is covered with, again, this vast desert, the Saharan desert, and it is a gigantic territorial domain that is inhabited by different nomadic groups, tribal groups that have adapted to that way of life. Okay, so keep that in mind, again, that they are situated in a very convenient position that will be very critical for the survival, if you will, of the desert peoples of the Saharan desert. The group that will rise to the top of society and really creating the very first kingdom in Mali was a lineage group called the Mande lineage group. They domesticated the horse, and the horse was considered to be one of the most important assets for the Mande lineage group, because they used the horse not only for transportation purposes, but also to carry out warfare as well. Okay, warfare. And they domesticated the horse, they adapted to it, and they were skilled expert horsemen. They will fight on horseback. It provided great mobility during warfare, and they were very jealous of that technology, the horse technology, to the point that it was prohibited to actually sell or trade their horses for anything else. Okay, because they knew that this will give other societies an advantage. In other words, again, they kept it for themselves. The other asset was iron. They're iron producers. This is a society of blacksmiths per excellence. In fact, the Mande had fraternities of blacksmiths in which the knowledge for forging iron was also very secretive and concealed. It was not shared to anybody else within the society, much less to people outside the society. Again, because this is also considered an asset as well, iron. So it is here, because they had both horses and iron ore in their geography, that this is going to give them an advantage over the societies around them. Another asset was gold. Again, this is a region of Africa that possessed the largest gold deposits in the entire continent. And we see a great mining center here, Timbuktu, as it was called. And this is going to be the main center of operations for the extraction of gold. And Timbuktu will be the main supplier of gold, not only in Africa, but also to the world at large. Again, it's really coming from Timbuktu, again, from Mali. Now, as I mentioned, we have different kinds of geographical settings, different ecologies, for example, and it required bartering and sharing, or trading, bartering, again, products that desert peoples and the peoples of Mali, each one had, and they both needed, of course, the products of the other because of their different ecologies. For example, in the Saharan desert, the nomadic groups there had something that the Mali people had, and those were, of course, camels. Okay, the camel had been domesticated in the desert. This is an animal that can go on and on for many, many days without a drop of water, and it was used for transportation purposes. But on the other hand, the desert peoples require wood, and they didn't have any wood. The grasslands peoples, the peoples of Mali, had the wood, because wood was used to heat up, of course, for example, to cook food, or to provide heat during nights. The nights in the deserts are extremely cold, so the people of the desert require that natural resource. So there's going to be a kind of trading network between Mali and the Saharan nomads, in which they traded wood and gold for camels. So again, the peoples of Mali actually adopted the camel in about 200 AD, and we see the emergence of those networks, again, that I just showed you in the map. And there were merchant caravans. There were caravans of merchants that were traveling back and forth across the network, taking wood and gold into the desert and bringing camels back to Mali as well, that were used for transportation purposes. So we see an interconnectedness across West Africa and also North Africa. Now, at some point, the Arabs are going to arrive around the 8th century AD. They're going to be moving very rapidly. We're talking about the 7th, 8th, and 9th century. We're going to see an Arab expansion across North Africa, and they will be seizing certain territories of North Africa as well, the Arabs, as they're spreading Islam as well, the Caliphate, for example, that I showed you early on. in the first topic. So what that did is that at some point, the network that had been built by Mali will be also interconnected with the Middle East, with the Arabian world, in the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabs are also exporting products into the Middle East. One of those commodities that were exported by the Arabs were slaves, by the way. The Arabs are exporting slaves out of Africa and taking them into the Middle East to grow sugar, for instance. This network is also going to extend all the way to Asia as well, through that network that I just told you, how the Muslims are beginning to take over again the Southeast Asian, network as well. So the African network is now interconnecting with the Middle Eastern world, but also the Asian world as well. So commodities, products that were generated in Mali like gold, copper, ivory, and wood ended up not only in the Saharan desert, they also ended up moving out into the network that I just explained, whether it's the Arabian Peninsula or Asia. And likewise, Mali was also importing products that were produced by Asian society like spices, silks, and silver as well. It was now importing those products again. So we have this trans-Saharan trade routes, again, that is not just the Saharan desert interconnected within Africa, but again, is extending into the outside as well. So those are global networks now. We see the emergence of those global networks. Most of the towns and the settlements across North Africa became really de facto trading outposts. No, they were the recipients of goods that merchants traveling across the networks, whether those were African or those were Arabian, again, were meeting in order to exchange goods. Now, during this process, what is also occurring is that over time, there's going to be a certain conversion to Islam by the many rulers of the kingdoms, particularly in this case, the rulers of Mali will be converting to Islam. And it's also an expedient conversion as well. It was an expedient conversion to Islam from their perspective because they found that among the Muslims, there were certain experts bringing in, for example, knowledge about, let's say, administration, knowledge about astronomy, science, for example, managing the state. So in many cases, the Muslims served as administrators and bureaucrats for the African kingdoms. And it's one of the main reasons why those rulers ended up converting to Islam. Again, it was, they wanted that knowledge, the expertise, and the technologies that they were bringing. By the 13th century, Mali was already a trading empire in its own right. It was a vast empire producing gold, the main supplier of gold to the global economy, at least the networks that were connected to it. And this is more evident when we see, for example, one of the rulers, Mansa Musa, in the 14th century, taking on this pilgrimage to Mecca in the Arabian Peninsula. He had converted to Islam, and he moved into Mecca, and along the network, along the pilgrimage, he was flooding the network with just so much gold. It was his way of expressing charity, for example, in alms to the poor. He was giving so much gold along the network that he, for a while, devalued the worth of gold because it was just so abundant. Again, he created a boom of gold that the value actually decreased for a little while. Again, this is how much gold it was producing. Okay, now once we move into the 1500s and 1600s, this empire entered a decline, and part of this reason had to do with, once again, climate change, a change of climate, a wetter climate in this case, that affected the horse population of Mali, because horses in Africa were affected by the presence of a fly, otherwise known as the tsetse fly. it was called the tested fly, that becomes more abundant, it proliferates with the presence of humidity and water and rainfall. So as we see a wetter climate affecting Africa, particularly West Africa, we see the presence of this fly affecting the horse population, and this is going to decimate, of course, the cavalry, the massive armies that the empire had built, and they're going to lose one of the greatest assets, of course, that they had forged over time to build their strength and their territorial expansion. Okay, the horse, in other words. So what we see, of course, is as we move into the 15 and 1600s, this empire was already in the decline, but the network remained in place, and this is going to be used later on, of course, for the export and import of products in and out of Africa to the rest of the world. Now, we have run out of time, but when we come back, we're going to look at two more networks. One is in the Indian Ocean, which was really considered the center of world trade, and then another one finally in the Mediterranean world. And this is going to lead us to the time of the integration of all the networks into one, as we'll see. And after we do that, we're going to be moving into part 2 in the second session, and that is climate change. Okay, all of this will be explained quite fully when we come back in session 2. Thank you.